The gate swings open at 7:14 inches the morning, and the first thing I notice is the smell. Clean air. Salt from the Hauraki Gulf drifting in from somewhere past the car park. 63 years old, and I had forgotten what clean air smelled like. I stand there for a moment longer than I need to. Not because I am emotional, not because I am lost. I stand there because I want to remember exactly how this feels. The gravel under my shoes, the gray Auckland sky, the particular quality of silence that exists just outside a place that was never silent. I want to burn it into my memory so that on the days ahead, when things get complicated, I can come back to this moment and remember why I did what I did. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 63 years old. I was a civil engineer for 31 years. I built bridges, drainage systems, roads through the Waikato that people drive on every day without thinking about the man who designed them. I raised 2 children in a 4-bedroom house in Remuera. I paid my taxes, coached junior rugby for 11 seasons, and never once in my life expected to spend 14 months inside Waikeria Prison for something I did not do. My friend Ross is leaning against his Hilux at the far end of the car park. He has a thermos of tea and the kind of expression on his face that men of a certain age reserve for moments that are too large to address directly. He lifts his chin when he sees me. That is all. I lift mine back. That is enough. He pours tea into the thermos lid and hands it to me before I have even reached the passenger door. I drink it, standing up. It is strong and slightly too sweet, and it is the best thing I have tasted in 14 months. You look terrible, he says. I feel tremendous, I say. He almost smiles. Almost. We drive north on State Highway 1, and neither of us speaks for a long time. The land opens up the way it always does when you leave Hamilton behind wide paddocks, the occasional dairy shed, the hills going green and gold in the early light. I watch it all go past, and I think about my daughter, Renata. I think about what she said to me at the hearing. I think about the documents she filed. I think about the 18 months she had while I was inside, moving through my life like a woman who had already inherited everything and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. And then I stop thinking about Renata, because there will be time for that. There is plenty of time for that now. I should tell you how it started. Not from the very beginning. I am not a man who believes in beginning at the beginning when the middle is where everything actually happened. But you need enough to understand. My wife, Patricia, passed away in March of 2022. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors told us was actually a mercy, though it did not feel like one. Patricia and I had been married for 38 years. We had built everything together. The house in Remuera, the batch up at Mangahai, a small commercial property in Takapuna that we had bought in 2009 when nobody wanted commercial property and which had appreciated rather handsomely in the years since. We had 2 children. Marcus, our son, who lives in Christchurch with his wife, and 3 boys, and works in logistics, and Renata, our daughter, who had moved back to Auckland from Melbourne in 2019 and had been, I thought at the time, a wonderful source of support during her mother's illness. She was there at the hospital. She organized the roster of visitors. She held Patricia's hand in the final days with a tenderness that made me believe, despite everything that had happened between us over the years, that she had grown into a good person. I was wrong about that. Or perhaps I was right about the tenderness and wrong about what it meant. Patricia's estate was not complicated. The house and the batch were to pass to me. The Takapuna property was to be divided equally between Marcus and Renata upon my death, or sold with proceeds split equally should I choose to sell it before then. There were some superannuation funds, some KiwiSaver accounts, and a small collection of jewelry that Patricia wanted Renata to have. All of this was documented in a will that Patricia and I had drawn up together in 2018 with a solicitor named Douglas Feather, who had done our legal work for the better part of 20 years. Renata knew the terms of the will. She had been present for the conversation about it. She had nodded. She had said, "That's completely fair, Dad." In August of 2022, 5 months after Patricia died, Renata came to me with a proposition. She said she wanted to manage the Takapuna property on my behalf, handle the tenants, oversee the maintenance, deal with the paperwork. She said I was still grieving and that I should not be burdened with the administrative detail of being a landlord. She said she would do it as a gift, no management fee, nothing like that. Just a daughter helping her father. I said yes. I said yes because I was still grieving, and because the administrative detail of being a landlord genuinely was a burden I did not want, and because she was my daughter and I believed that meant something. She asked me to sign a property management authority giving her the right to act on my behalf in matters relating to the Takapuna property. I signed it. Douglas had retired by then, and I did not think to have a new solicitor look at it. That was my mistake. That was the crack in the wall that everything else came through. I will not bore you with all of the legal details because frankly some of them still make my head ache. What I will tell you is that the document Renata had prepared was not a standard property management authority. It was something considerably broader, a document that, under certain circumstances that her solicitor had very carefully arranged, could be interpreted as granting her significant control over decisions affecting the property itself, not merely its day-to-day management. I did not know this at the time. I found out later. Much later. What I did know, about 9 months after signing that document, was that there was a man in my life named Derek Voss. Renata had been seeing Derek for approximately 2 years. He was 51, divorced twice, and had a very specific kind of confidence that I have learned to distrust the confidence of a man who has never once in his life believed that the rules applied to him. He drove a black Range Rover. He called me Gerald in a tone that managed to make my own name sound vaguely insulting. I did not like Derek Voss. I told Renata this, carefully, once. In the spring of 2023, I said that I had some concerns. I said that I hoped she was being careful. I said that from what I had observed, Derek struck me as a man who was very interested in what Renata might eventually have, rather than in Renata herself. She did not speak to me for 3 weeks after that conversation. When she came back, she was pleasant and warm and brought me a meal from a restaurant I liked, and she said she understood that I was worried and that she appreciated it. And we did not mention Derek again. 6 weeks later, the police came to my door. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened, because even now, telling it, I feel something rise up in me that I have to breathe through deliberately. The allegation was that I had harassed Derek Voss, that on 4 separate occasions I had attended his place of business in Newmarket, had made threatening remarks, had on one occasion physically grabbed him by the collar in front of witnesses. I had never been to Derek Voss's place of business. I did not know where it was. I had met the man perhaps 8 times in total. Always at family gatherings, always in the presence of other people. I had spoken to him politely. I had shaken his hand. But there were witnesses. 3 of them, 2 of Derek's employees and a woman I had never met who described me in precise detail my height, my gray hair, the green swandry jacket I wore in winter. There were dates and times. There was CCTV footage of a man in a green jacket in the car park of Derek's building, though the image was not clear enough to confirm identity with certainty. There was Renata, who told the police that she was afraid for Derek's safety, that I had never accepted their relationship, that I had made comments about what would happen if he was still in her life when I died and she came into her inheritance. That last part is what cost me, because you have to understand the context. There was the property management document that Renata's solicitor had constructed so carefully. There had been some correspondence emails I had sent to Renata asking questions about the Takapuna property. Questions about whether Derek was involved in any decisions about it. Questions that, in retrospect, when read by a prosecutor looking for evidence of motive, could be made to sound like the communications of a man who was hostile and controlling and frightened of losing financial control. My barrister was good. She was excellent, in fact. But the witnesses were consistent, and Renata was composed on the stand in a way that I have thought about many times since. The composure of someone who had prepared. I was convicted of intimidation and harassment. I was sentenced to 14 months. The judge noted my clean record and my age, and said he hoped the sentence would serve as a period of reflection. 14 months of reflection. Marcus flew up from Christchurch the week after sentencing. We sat in his car in a car park in Mount Eden, and he cried in a way that I had not seen since he was 8 years old, and had broken his arm falling out of the macrocarpa at the bottom of our garden. I told him to stop. I told him I needed him to stay clear-headed. I told him there were things I needed him to do. I want to tell you something about those 14 months, because I think people imagine that prison is a place where time stops. It does not. Time moves, and if you choose to use it properly, a great deal can happen. I wrote letters. Not angry letters. I am not an angry man by nature. Which is part of why the conviction was so absurd to anyone who knew me. Careful letters. Letters to Douglas Feather, who had retired to Taupo, and who, upon receiving mine, was troubled enough by what I described to refer me to a colleague, a property lawyer named Simone Akebe, who worked out of an office on Queen Street and who had a very particular interest in cases involving elder financial abuse. I had long conversations with Ross, who visited every 3 weeks without fail, and who, on the outside, was doing things I had asked him to do. Quiet things, patient things, the kind of things that do not look like anything at all until suddenly they look like everything. I read. Not novels. I am not a novel man. I read the company's office records. I read the Land Information New Zealand title records that Marcus had obtained on my behalf and sent in printed form because I had asked him to. I read the property management document line by line until I understood exactly what it said and exactly what had been done with it. Renata had not been idle during my 14 months. In October of 2023, 4 months after my sentencing, she had filed an application with the family court arguing that my conviction, combined with what she described as a pattern of erratic and aggressive behavior, demonstrated that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. She sought appointment as my property manager under the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act. She did not succeed with that application. Marcus had engaged Simone Chebe by then, and Simone had appeared at the hearing and had said several things that caused the family court judge to decline the application in terms that Simone later described to me as unusually pointed for family court. But Renata had not stopped there. Using the authority I had signed in August of 2022, the document I had believed was a property management authority and which was, in fact, something considerably more elastic, she had entered into a heads of agreement with a property development company in which Derek Voss held a 22% stake. The heads of agreement related to the Takapuna property. It was not a sale. Not yet. It was described as an option arrangement. A right of first refusal. Structured in a way that, had it proceeded to its next stage, would have made it extremely difficult for me to sell or refinance the property without Derek Voss's company having a seat at the table. She had also, and this is the part that still takes me a moment to fully process, approached Marcus. She had told Marcus that I had, prior to my conviction, expressed a wish to reorganize the ownership structure of the estate, that I had spoken to her about potentially transferring the Takapuna property into a family trust with herself as the sole trustee on the grounds that Marcus lived in Christchurch and could not practically manage it. She had sent Marcus documents. She had told him that I had already signed some of them. She had asked him to sign the rest. Marcus had called her and asked to see the documents I had supposedly already signed. She had said they were with the solicitor, and she would arrange it. She had not arranged it. The call had happened in February of 2024. By then, I had 4 months left to serve. And Simone Achebe had already begun building what she had described to me, in one of our correspondence letters, as a fairly robust response. The morning I walked out of Waikeria, Ross drove me to Simone's office. Not her Queen Street office, she had moved to a newer space in Britomart. I sat in a chair that was considerably more comfortable than anything I had sat in for 14 months, and she walked me through what she had. The heads of agreement was voidable. The authority I had signed had been obtained by misrepresentation. Simone had a statement from Douglas Feather, meticulously detailed, describing what a standard property management authority looked like, and how the document I had signed differed from that in ways that were not accidental. She had an expert witness, a property law specialist from the University of Auckland, who was prepared to say the same thing in court. She had Ross's records. For 14 months, Ross had been doing something very specific on my behalf. He had been attending, quietly and without announcing himself, the same industry events that Derek Voss attended. Business association, dinners, property investment forums, the kinds of gatherings where men like Derek Voss talked freely because they believed themselves to be among allies. Ross had taken notes. Ross had spoken to people. Ross had, over the course of 14 months, assembled a picture of Derek Voss's financial position that was, to put it gently, not the picture of a man who was primarily interested in Renata. Derek Voss's 2 previous marriages had both ended in circumstances involving disputes over jointly held property. His business had been placed in receivership in 2018 and had re-emerged under a slightly different name. There were 3 civil judgments against him in the Auckland District Court. His 22% stake in the development company had been acquired in exchange for debt that the company still owed him, which meant that an option arrangement over a fully owned Auckland commercial property was, for Derek Voss, almost entirely about the security it would provide against that debt. Renata did not know all of this. I am fairly certain of that. I do not believe she understood the full shape of what Derek was using her for. I do not think that excuses her, but I think it explains the particular quality of composure she had shown in court, the composure of a woman who had convinced herself that what she was doing was justified, that she was protecting something, that she was right. She was not right, but she believed she was, and in some ways that made the whole thing more sad than it might otherwise have been. I did not contact Renata after I was released. Not for 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were not idle. Simone filed the application to void the heads of agreement. She also filed a separate proceeding for misrepresentation in relation to the property authority document. There was a meeting between her and the solicitors for Derek's development company at which Simone apparently said a number of things that caused those solicitors to become very interested in speaking to Derek before responding. Marcus flew up and stayed in the Remuera house with me for a week. We watched rugby in the evenings, and he cooked. Badly, but enthusiastically, and on a Tuesday morning we sat at the kitchen table, and I told him everything that I had not been able to tell him while I was inside. He listened the way Patricia used to listen, quietly, completely, not interrupting to insert his own reactions. When I finished, he sat for a moment, and then he said, "What do you need from me?" I told him. 3 weeks after my release, on a Thursday afternoon in April, I was sitting at the kitchen table, eating toast and reading the Herald on my laptop, something I had been doing every morning and most afternoons, simply because I could when my phone rang. It was Renata. "Dad," she said. "I think we need to talk," I said. "Yes, I think we do." She came that evening. She sat across the table from me in the kitchen where she had grown up, and I thought, looking at her, About all of the mornings she had sat in that same chair eating Weet-Bix before school. About the time she was 14 and she had broken one of her mother's favorite cups and cried about it for an entire afternoon. About the particular way she carried herself that had always reminded me of Patricia. She looked, that evening, like someone who had recently received some news and had not yet found a way to arrange her face around it. She said that she understood there were proceedings underway. She said that she felt things had gotten out of hand. She said that she wanted to find a resolution. I listened to everything she said. I let her finish. And then I said, "Renata, Simone will be in contact with your solicitor tomorrow morning. I think at this point the conversation needs to happen at that level." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you going to forgive me?" I thought about that question. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering at this point in a story like this one. What I felt was not anger. Anger had exhausted itself somewhere around the 9th or 10th month at Waikeria. What I felt was something more like grief. The particular grief of losing something that you realize you may have never quite had in the form you believed you did. I said, "I don't know yet, but I want you to understand something. What happens with the property, what happens in court, that is separate. That is not about forgiveness. That is about accountability. They are not the same thing." She left shortly after that. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car go down the driveway, and I felt the quiet of the house around me, and I thought about Patricia, the way I still do every evening, and I thought about what she would have made of all of this. Patricia had always seen Renata more clearly than I had. She had loved her without any of my particular blindness. I think she would have been heartbroken. I think she also would have known exactly what to do. I knew what to do. I had known for 14 months. The proceedings were resolved over the following 8 weeks. The heads of agreement was voided. The property authority was set aside. The Takapuna property remained mine, unencumbered, which at current valuations represents something that I will leave at that without specifying further. Derek Voss's development company did not pursue the matter further, which told me everything I needed to know about the strength of their actual legal position. Derek Voss himself disappeared from Renata's life approximately 6 weeks after the proceedings concluded. This, Simone told me, was not entirely a coincidence. Some of what Ross had gathered had found its way, through entirely proper channels, to people who had professional reasons to be interested in it. Renata and I are not estranged. I want to be clear about that, because I think the people who will hear this story will be waiting for one of two endings: either a tearful reconciliation or a permanent severance. And the truth is that what happened was neither. We are in a process. We speak on the phone every couple of weeks. There is a distance between us that was not there before, and I am not certain yet whether it will close. I hope that it does. I am not yet certain that I trust that hope. Marcus brings his boys up from Christchurch twice a year. Last October they ran through the Mangahai batch like it was the most exciting place on earth, which at their ages I suppose it was. I stood on the deck watching them, and Ross stood beside me, and we drank cold spates and did not need to say anything about any of it, because we were past the age of needing to say things that could simply be stood in. I want to say something to you now that I could not have said in those 14 months because I was still too close to the heat of it. I spent a long time before all of this believing that family loyalty was something that existed regardless of circumstances, that whatever else happened, the people you loved and raised and invested your entire life in building something with, that those people were constant. That was perhaps the most expensive belief I have ever held. What I understand now is that love and loyalty are not the same thing, and confusing them is a trap that costs people everything. You can love someone and still not trust them. You can forgive someone and still not allow them access to the parts of your life that require trust. These distinctions matter enormously, and we do our children no favors by failing to make them. I am 63 years old, and I am sitting in a house in Remuera that I own without qualification, and the property on Takapuna is returning a very satisfactory income. And every morning, I eat toast and read the Herald, and the air coming through the kitchen window is clean and salt-edged and entirely free. The cage opened. The man who walked out was not the same man who walked in. He was considerably more clear-eyed, and he knew, without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what he was worth, not in any financial sense, but in the deeper sense that Patricia always understood, and that took me rather longer to learn. You cannot put a good man down permanently. You can inconvenience him. You can cost him time. You can take 14 months of clean air and Morning Herald and cold spates on a Mangahuai deck. But the man himself, the accumulated weight of his decisions, his relationships, the work he has put into building something honest that you cannot take, not with false witnesses, not with clever documents, not with a composed and believing daughter, and a twice-divorced man in a black Range Rover. You cannot take what a man has genuinely built. And the older I get, the more certain I am that this is the only thing in any of our lives that is actually worth building in the first place.